Hello friends, today's topic of discussion is patriotic films during British times. In the earlier discussion on the patriotic films during the British times, we talked about some of the ideas with regard to the patriotic films. We also talked about some of the genres which were trying to reflect the ideas of the patriotic cinema, and how the idea of patriotism was very important in the framework of the national movement as well, because the Indians, they wanted to get rid of the British rule, and how the colonial rule was trying to exploit Indians at every level, whether the economic, social, political, cultural. So all these kinds of things, we find that how Indians, they were being exploited at different levels. And in that framework, when one is talking about, we talked about some of the initial genres on which the films, they were being made. As I told you, that from 1913 to 31 we had the silent cinema, and in the silent cinema a number of films dealing with the mythological themes, dealing with the devotional themes, they were also being made, and how these kinds of themes, they were also trying to talk about the national movement, whether the kind of ideas which were shown in Raja Harishchandra, or the insistence of Raja Harishchandra on truth, could also be seen in the framework of Mahatma Gandhi's Satyagraha. And the ideas which were there in the stunt films of those times, they were trying to convey the ideas of democracy and the ideas of good governance, and all these kinds of ideas, they were being talked about in the films of that particular period, which were the stunt films. And these stunt films, they were also trying to, in a way, communicate those kinds of ideas, where they were trying to mock the authorities through the names of the films, or through the film studios names, where you have the Hindu Mata films, etc. And we also find that they were trying to advocate democracy, the ideas of freedom of speech and expression. They were also being talked about in these films, and how in the climax scenes we find that there was a victory of good over evil, and the legitimate over illegitimate. And these kinds of things, they sharpened the people's desire for freedom. And we find that when these kinds of stunt films, as we talked about Sikandar, they were being exhibited for the entertainment of troops, they also realized the undercurrents of the stunt films, which advocated the victory of the good over evil, democracy, justice, good governance. All these films, they were trying to communicate these ideas. And many a times, because of the revolutionary content, these films, they were not being allowed in the cantonment areas. And the film journalist like K. Abbas, he says that in the atmosphere of the growing anti-imperialism, even the coerced stunt films, they were used to portray and glorify the democratic aspirations of the masses. And if the British censors, they were satisfied in the climax by the installation of a legitimate heir on throne, the audience could not forget the earlier sequences dramatizing the general public's defiance of a tyrant's authority. And many of the filmmakers, some of them like J.B.H. Wadia, he says that his films were deliberate and well thought out exercise in promoting and propagating the ideas of democracy and freedom. And if you see the other films, we find that some of the essential themes of his films, they were related to untouchability, literacy campaign and dignity of labor, plea for democracy, anti-fascism and emancipation of Indian women. So we find that all these kinds of ideas, they were there in many of the films which were made by J.B.H. Wadia. And he also, in a way, accepted in one of the interviews later that all these kinds of ideas, they were well thought out, and they also wanted to show the ideas of democracy and freedom to the masses, and they were being masked in the film in a certain manner, because if they will be shown in direct manner, then they will be cut or in a way removed by the colonial censors. So the Indian filmmakers, they were trying to, in a way, hoodwink the censorship authorities of the British in that sense, and try to portray these kinds of ideas. We also see during this time that how many of the films which were talking about the caste system or mismatched marriages, or the idea of Hindu-Muslim unity, and how many of the films like Rath in 1931, it was dealing with the issue of poverty, untouchability, social inequality. And in this film there was a character called Garib Das, who was an exact image of Gandhi, and how this film was cut by the Bombay censors and it was renamed as Khuda Ki Shaan, or the glory of God. Apart from that, we also see that many of the social ideas, though they were in the framework of the national movement, but they were also very imperative. In that sense, they will also in a way provide some kind of a thrust to the national movement when the problems of untouchability or the intercaste barriers which were creating division in the society, when they will be removed, and how Gandhi saw it, described colonial rule as a scourge and untouchability as a plague. So we find a film called Achut Kanya, which was made in 1936, was dealing with this issue, apart from Achut, which was made in 1940, that how human beings, those who are there on the earth, they belong to the same stock, and these kinds of distinctions which are there on the basis of religion or in the basis of caste, all these kinds of distinctions are artificial in nature and they should be done away with. Similarly, as I told you that the issue of emancipation of women was very important at that point of time. In some of the films, they were also trying to communicate these kinds of ideas through a film called Duniya Na Mani in 1937, which was dealing with the issue of mismatched marriages, and the female protagonist, the role played by Shanta Apte, she in a way exhibits the revolutionary reform spirit of a woman and realizes that the emancipation of women lies in their own hands and makes efforts to overcome her problems or limitations. And she in a way refuses to consummate the marriage because she is being tricked into marriage to an old man, and when she refuses to consummate the marriage, the old man is being forced to rethink because he had children the age of his new wife. So finally, as divorces were not all that common in those times, and the old man who had married Shanta Apte in the film, he did not find any kind of an alternative and he commits suicide so that she becomes free. So this idea was quite ahead of its time, and Shantaram was able to do justice to this particular film in that sense that it was talking far ahead or thinking or portraying far ahead of its times. And when you talk about other films of this particular period, we find that a film called Brandy Ki Bottle, which was against liquor and the prohibition. It was supporting the prohibition campaign, and a lot of slogans which are emphasizing the independence, they are being shown in the film, and there is a lot of reference to Gandhi and Patel, and how it was also the reflective of the mood of combat among people. And as I told you earlier as well, that Patel also lent his voice in a framework of a speech which was added to this film. And if you see the patriotic fervor of this film, where dialogues like Sharab Chhodna Azadi ki pehli manzil hai, giving up liquor is the first step in the attainment of independence, or Gandhi is referred to as Azadi ka Devta, or the angel of God in this film. So we find that these kinds of ideas, they were being propagated in such kind of films, and people, when they saw these kinds of films, they definitely were influenced by these kinds of ideas. Apart from that, we also see that Shantaram made other films as well, like Padosi and Admi, and how in Padosi the kind of divisions which are created by the British between the Hindus and Muslims is being shown. Similarly, we find that Dr. Kotnis ki Amar Kahani was relating to the medical mission at that point of time. So V. Shantaram was trying to make a lot of meaningful films, and this particular film, Dr. Kotnis ki Amar Kahani, was a war effort film, and as it was being demanded by the British in those times, that filmmakers, they had to resort in terms of making the war effort films in support of the British. And we find that how Admi was in reaction to Devdas, which was made in 1935, and it had a lot of pessimism, and V. Shantaram realized that this kind of pessimism was in a way affecting the society in a negative manner. So he wanted to show something positive to the audience, and in this particular film he tries to communicate this kind of an idea where there is a love between a policeman and a prostitute, and how the idea of going forward in life is being shown in this particular film. We also see during this period that the Progressive Writers Association was also there under the presidency of Munshi Premchand, and how young and aspiring writers and poets, they came under its umbrella, and it was a major cultural initiative to introduce the political awareness and social realism in cinema. And we also see when this kind of an association was there, many people, or many people those who were aspiring to join the film industry, they also joined this particular organization initially, and later many of them, they shifted to film industry as well. We also see that there was an idea of Italian neorealism, and its influence could be seen on the Indian films in the framework of the non-professional actors, outdoor locations, and the simple dialogues. So many of the issues of the neorealist films in the framework of poverty, unemployment, and the socio-economic problems of those times, they were being reflected in the filmmakers like Roberto Rossellini, Visconti, De Sica, and how these filmmakers, they were trying to project an alternative reality in Italy. And some of the Indian filmmakers, they were also in a way influenced by these ideas, and we can also say that these kinds of things, they already they existed in the Indian society, where there was a lot of poverty because of the continuous exploitation of the Indian resources by the British, and the issue of unemployment, illiteracy, poverty, all of them, they were there in the Indian society as well, and because of which we find that Bimal Roy's Udair Pathi or Hamrahi in Hindi was a landmark film, which was also talking about the ideas of patriotism and nationalism, and through its hero, we find that Udair Pathi became some kind of a film which was trying to deal, or trying to show the ideas of the national movement as well. And the film called Dharti Ki Lal was trying to show the Bengal famine of 1943, which was a man-made famine, and because of the policies of the British, we find that so many people, they suffered, and how the food grains from India, they were being exported to the war scenes where British, they were fighting the battle. Similarly, Neecha Nagar of Chetan Anand was trying to show the distinctions which were there in the society between the people, those who were from the elite section of the society, and the poor, those who were living in the Neecha Nagar. And we find that this kind of a patriotic flavor or fervor which was there in these films, how many of them, they tried to show them through the scenes and the dialogues, and how censors, they were not happy with such kind of portrayals. And even in the European and the American films, any reference to patriotism and independence was not tolerated, because the British, they realized if these kinds of films, if they will be shown to the Indians, then definitely Indians, they will be influenced by the revolutionary and the patriotic ideas. Then we also find that because of the censorship authority or the machinery which was there, and which was being applied to the Indian films, Bhakt Vidur, a film in 1921, a silent film of the Kohinoor films, it depicted the story of the Vidurji of Mahabharat in an allegorical portrayal of Gandhian political activities. And Vidurji, as he was referred to in the subtitles, was shown supporting a Gandhi cap, clad in khaddar, sitting beside a charkha to spin yarn, all being powerful symbols of the freedom struggle. So we find that such kind of portrayals, where some kind of similarity could be shown between the national movement leaders and the people, those who were being shown on the screen, also motivated the masses in a certain sense. And scholars like S.T. Bhaskaran has said that there were scenes recalling the recent political events in the province of Bombay, refusal of peasants to pay tax in Kaira in 1918, and the evacuation of town by people as protest against government Chirala in 1921. So these kinds of things, they could also have some kind of resonances when we find that the contemporary events and the ideas which were shown in the films, they had some kind of similarities. So people, they could relate with these kinds of ideas. And even in the film Bhakt Vidur, as I told you, the loyal officers in the court of Dhritarashtra, who represented King Emperor in the film, were awarded the Danki Bahadur titles, which was an obvious spoof on the Diwan Bahadur titles which were given by the British. and the government clamped a ban on this film by calling it a thinly veiled resume of the political events in India. And we also see that apart from that, there were other films like Reth, which were dealing with the religious bigotry, caste system, non-violence and untouchability. And in this film, the character Baba Garib Das, played by Kovas J. Makanda, had a remarkable physical resemblance to Mahatma Gandhi, to whom caste and creed held no meaning. So we find that such kind of portrayals in these films, they were trying to question the kind of prevalent norms in the society, and Mahatma Gandhi is a leader not only of the national movement, but at the same time he was trying to reform the Indian society by talking about the emancipation of women or through the removal of untouchability. So all these kinds of ideas which were being reflected in the Gandhian philosophy, and even the lookalike of Gandhi was shown in this film, we find that it sends some kind of shivers down the spine of the censor, and it resorted to the large deletion of scene. And later this film was shown under the title of Khuda Ki Shaan, and we find that how many times films they were being in a way released with a lot of accessions and with a lot of deletions. And this happened with Mahatma, a Marathi film of 1935, which was based on the life of Saint Eknath and his fight against untouchability, which was again renamed as Dharmatma. And we also see that how the government censored the scenes of social religious reform in the films which were based on the life of saints, because they could be linked to the movement by Gandhi, and it bred the danger of propagation and proliferation of Gandhian objectives, ideals and philosophy. So in this way we find that British censorship was trying to consciously promote the American style obscene films to influence the cultural values of people, so that they can be misguided in their movement towards path of nationalist ideals and the movement. And how the arbitrary nature of the British policy, censorship policy, could also be seen, where the nationalist and the conscious Indian intellectual community very well understood this kind of a conspiracy in the cultural policy and its impact, and attacked the British in magazines like Abhyuday and Film India. And Abhyuday launched a comprehensive attack against such British designs in its column. So we find that British, they were very well aware about the kind of policies which they were following, and they wanted to weaken the Indian society through the introduction of various cultural practices from Britain. And apart from that, they also wanted to in a way divide the Hindus and the Muslims, and so that they do not pose any kind of a united challenge to them. And we find that in order to wean Muslims away from the national mainstream, British tried to placate them by becoming extremely sensitive to the issues that might offend the Muslims. And that is why we also find that they supported the Muslim League as well. And it was also reflected in the film censorship, where each board of film censors had 1 or 2 Muslim members whose suggestions relating to scenes dealing with Muslims were scrupulously carried out, and even a distant possibility of the offense to the Muslim sentiments was considered sufficient to censor a film. And there was a film called Virgin of Istanbul in 1920, which was passed by the censor board of Burma, and it was banned by the Bombay board, which thought that the certain ideas are likely to offend the Mohammedan community. So we find that British, they were in a way wary of fearing or hurting the Muslim sentiment. They had this kind of fear, and scholars like S.T. Bhaskaran, they have talked about the film called 40th Door, which was made in 1925, a story depicting the struggle between the Christians and the Muslims in the Middle East. And it was proscribed first in Bombay and then in other provinces, because it portrayed the Egyptian officials in an unsavory light. So we find that any kind of a portrayal of Muslims which might show them in a negative manner, it was being rejected by the censorship authorities, because they wanted to placate the Muslim sentiments. And how these kinds of concerns of the Muslims about the films which were hurting their sentiments can also be heard in the Legislative Assembly in 1933. in the words of Sheikh Sadiq Hassan, who says that there is a great resentment among the Muslim public when the scenes of haram life are depicted in films, and especially when historic Muslim queens and princesses are shown making love. So these kinds of ideas, when they were being shown, and the haram life was being shown during this time, so it was seen to be in that sense that it would hurt the Muslim sentiments, and these kinds of concerns, they were also being raised in the Legislative Assembly as well. And Times of India, dated 29 November 1935, it reported a scene there 2 to 50 feet in showing the several Muslims sitting around a table in a cosmopolitan club and drinking liquor, and it was deleted from a film produced in Bombay. So these kinds of concerns, they were being rejected by the censors, and in 1930s, when the sound came to the Indian film scene, then we find that India was dealing with the civil disobedience movement, which was started in 1930. And the talkies, they were being made in the local languages, so in that context there were some sort of a natural advantage over the competition with the foreign films. And we find that many of the Indian films companies, they got established very well because of the coming of sound, where now you have dialogues. And we find that many of the filmmakers and technicians, they were associated with the national movement. And how we find that during the civil disobedience movement, a large number of Indian films and documentaries, they had trouble with the censorship authority for some reason or other, and how we also find that allegory was being used by the filmmakers, symbols like charkha, portraits of Gandhi and Subhash, photographs, all of them, they were being shown in the films. And many times we find that they were not relevant to the story of the films, but despite that they were being shown in the films. And there was one song in a film called Kismat in 1943, आज हिमालय की चोटी से फिर हमने ललकारा है, दूर हटो ए दुनिया वालों, हिंदुस्तान हमारा है. So this kind of a reference was seen in this particular film, and it was also referring to the how British, they have to go and leave India. And when it was being investigated, it was being suggested by one of the film inspectors who was sent to see this film and report about the matter, that why audience was again and again asking to repeat this song or replay this song. So it was being suggested by him that it referred to the Germans and the Japanese, and not to the British. So in that way the matter was resolved, and we find that how British, they were trying to restrict the Indians in terms of the kind of raw material which was available to the Indians in terms of making films. So the length of the feature films was restricted to 11,000 feet and the trailers to 400 feet. And we also see that strict embargo was placed on the production of the new films, and even on making of the new prints of the duly certified pictures, except under a license from the government. And the license was given on the guarantee that every third film produced would be based on an approved subject. And apart from that, we also see that some of the films in South India which were made, K. Subramaniam made Manasam Rakshanam in defense of honor in Tamil, and how some kind of reference could be realized by the audience in this film as well, where there was a reference to go away to the Japanese, and the film could be echoing the slogan Quit India, which was addressed to the British. And we also find other films like Tyag Bhumi in Tamil in 1939, and how Gautam Kaul talks about that how the audience response to its symbolic interpretation was so wildly enthusiastic that the Madras district magistrate ordered confiscation of film print immediately. And how the censorship machinery was lenient to the issues of sensuality and morality, and they were not concerned with the ethics which were being shown in the films. And Rameshwari Nehru was a freedom fighter who was a member of the Punjab Provincial Centre Board, and she was in a way critical of this kind of a policy of the government, where any kind of ideas of national movement leaders, they were being removed. and no standards they were being observed for the maintenance of them. So this kind of a method where the censoring of the various kinds of scenes which was being done at that point of time, it was being rejected by many of the national leaders, including Rameshwari Nehru, and she says that any reference to the movement for the liberation of the country or the national leaders, it was considered to be some kind of a sedition, and it had to be removed, and the moral and the cultural level of the picture was of no concern to the censor board, and she resigned from the board because she could not reconcile herself to this method of censoring. So in that sense, when we tend to see that how the films of this particular period, they were trying to show the patriotic fervor through them, and the various genres of these films, whether the mythological devotionals or semi-historicals or stunt films or the theme of social reform, each one of them in their own way was trying to communicate the ideas of patriotism through them. And we also find that these kinds of interactions or interconnections between the Hindi films and the national movement or the freedom struggle could also be seen in many of the films, and all of this we also have discussed in the framework of the various films, and how these films they were being censored, how their dialogues they were being deleted, and we find that the issue of the censorship, which was arbitrary in nature and which was always politically inspired and always appeared to be motivated during the colonial period, was concerned with the revolutionary and the ideas of democracy. They were not at all concerned with the other ideas, whether they were related to the sex or violence, and they were being shown in many of the European films, and with regard to that concerns they were being raised by the Indians, that it was some kind of a conspiracy of the Europeans and Americans so as to in a way destroy the youth by making them astray. When such kind of presentations they will be available to the audience, then there was a lot of chance that from the cultural point of view it will be detrimental to the interests of the Indians. And in that context we find that the different leaders of the national movement, they also contributed in their own way through either legislative assembly, as was the case of Lala Lajpat Rai, or the support to the film industry through Swadeshi, as was the case with Tilak in the initial part. And we also see that how Sardar Patel, he played an important role, not only in terms of providing support to the film industry in the framework of recording their speeches or providing some kind of blessings to these films which were there with regard to the national movement, but we also find that how he also produced a film which was based on Netaji Subhash. So all this definitely played an important role in terms of the patriotic ideas and how these kinds of themes, they were also concerned with the national movement as well. So with this I'd like to end the discussion. Thank you very much.